I want to introduce our guest, who's an incredible author, historian, and a good friend of ours, David Pietrusza, who's authored many books. We have a book on 1920, 1948, 1960, and I've got, actually in my hand, the Silent Cowl's Almanac, which is the homespun wit and wisdom of Vermont's Calvin Coolidge, which was edited along with another book by David Pietrusza. David, it's great to have you on board with us today, and welcome to the program.
Great to be on and to talk to you again.
Well, it's an interesting week, and it's funny what they've done with our national holidays. I used to love celebrating Lincoln and Washington separately, and somehow we've managed to come up with this President's Day, which I think is really unfair to, I think if you look at the many presidents we've had, there are certainly a few that really stand above the rest, and then there are also a few that really stand below the rest. So I hate to take such greats as, Calvin Coolidge and a President Lincoln and George Washington and people of that nature and put them in the same category as a Jimmy Carter.
Or worse.
Or worse, yeah.
But yes, and we have this President's Day, which is a generic holiday. And what did that replace? It replaced Washington and it replaced Lincoln. There's nothing generic in any way, shape, or form about those two individuals. Those are giants. Those are individuals, and to devalue them is yet another form of the inflation running rampant in this country and society. You were talking before about how do we pay back the debt. Well, there's a little thing called inflation. And inflation, as it was famously observed, is repudiation. It is one form of bankruptcy. And one thing that the country, which formerly produced people like Washington and Lincoln, had an integrity to its work ethic and to its obligations. And we're not seeing that now.
No, that's a great point. You bring up the idea of inflation, and in today's administration, we actually are doing everything possible to keep inflation low by basically running with 0% interest rates, which is really contrary to allowing for free markets. And in a sense, it's the same thing as denying that we have a budget problem, that we have a deficit problem, that we have spending issues in this nation, which is completely opposite of the great thought that we got from not just George Washington, but also Abraham Lincoln, who were so serious about dealing with the current issues and really took them head on.
Well, they did, and George Washington had all the issues. I mean, he had to start from scratch. He had to create precedent, whether it would be, an inauguration. What form would that take? How would you address him? Whether there would be a cabinet or not. Those are all his inventions. And the two-term precedent, Lincoln has to deal with, it's flip a coin. Who has to deal with the greater challenges? Lincoln has to deal with the Civil War. He has to deal with dissent at home. And at the same time, if you look at his domestic policy in the midst of this, there's some tremendous things which are pushed by the administration, by the Congress, the Homestead Act, the memorial land grants, colleges, the railroads crisscrossing the country. There are things going on. There are also some things which could be questioned, not only in terms of how he fought the war, but we got the first income tax under him. Interestingly enough, it was a flat tax. But something, you start a tax here, and before you know it, it goes there. So within a single year, it was a progressive tax. He also was dealing with paper currency, fiat currency, a wartime measure. Everything he did was a wartime measure, but certainly a bad precedent in terms of how the country progressed. But again, you take a look at things, and things can reverse themselves. There are reversible things. We went from a fiat currency during the war, Civil War, to getting rid of the greenbacks 20 years later and putting the country on a gold standard, which lasted for another 50 or 60 years until Franklin Roosevelt overturned that in 1933.
David, isn't this a time in history when, and obviously we can't immediately right the wrongs of this recent election, but wasn't this a unique time in history where we almost need the perfect combination of Washington and his dedication to the founding principles and his personal willingness to sacrifice his own what his own personal desires were for what he felt was the need to help the country, and on the side of Lincoln, somebody who really understood that the nation needs healing, and not only do we need to heal the nation's wounds, but we need to sort of bind the nation and put it towards a new track. And instead, I feel like we have somebody who's running away from the founding principles and is actually creating additional wounds.
Well, I wouldn't say running away from the founding principles. I'd say running towards the founding principles to beat them over the head with a club. When you see we could talk about the deficit. Certainly, that was one of the flaws of the Constitution. It's like, we never foresaw when the people running our country would be for decades so irresponsible to hardly ever manage to balance the budget. So, we had a chance a few decades ago to put a balanced budget amendment in. It failed by one vote in the United States Senate. I think it's time to reintroduce that, although the chances of getting even a budget, let alone a balanced budget through the Senate is a pretty dicey thing. Maybe we'll see one shortly, or maybe we won't. Or it will just be a sort of thing which is put out there to put it out, and then we go on to the next farce in our national comedy. But what particularly concerns me, we've seen an erosion from states' rights. We've seen erosions of what the federal government can intrude on, going back really to the progressive era. But what we are seeing now is a ratcheting up of this thing. Well, get it done, which translates into executive orders of dubious constitutionality, legality, trampling on the separation of powers. It's like gridlock. That's the wrong term for it. It's separation of powers. That is what the government and the Constitution was designed to do, which was to prevent one-man rule. So
one of the problems that I feel we have is a lack of respect for the founders. And by that I mean when you look at the gridlock conversation, or when you look at the debate over things like the Second Amendment right now, I hear some otherwise very intelligent people who say, you know what, we have to make radical changes to the Founding Fathers' documents because the Founding Fathers had no idea. They didn't envision drones when they created the amendments. They didn't envision the Internet and so forth. So the question I have from you is, and maybe it's a commentary on my comment here, is when I look back in the days prior to TV, the early Founding Fathers seemed to be extraordinarily well-read people, and they had a great depth of history in their own personal knowledge base. So it seems to me like looking at history, they had to be able to envision that the same kind of growth that occurred in the past would happen in the future, and they must have had the ability to envision not what the future would hold, but that continued evolution would occur, and that these principles must support that evolution.
Well, what they also had was a deep knowledge. You said being well read, that they had a knowledge of what went before. And what went before in terms of non-monarchical systems, in terms of republics, in terms of democracy, was a history of failure. Monarchies kind of worked. They lasted. Republics and such did not work, whether it was Greece or Rome or the Dutch Republic, or the experiments, quite often bloody, in England, the Polish Republic, which was collapsing as they were writing their documents and was going to be carved up between three powers. And this was studied decades ago, around 1970, by a guy who's still around. He has a new book out, Bernard Bailyn. It was the ideological origins of the American Revolution. So they looked at these things. They wanted to see what sort of system would be fine-tuned to avoid all of those things. So they looked to the past, and they also looked to the future. But the argument that the founding fathers couldn't envision something, they were of another era, well, does the same argument hold for the 13th Amendment? Perhaps the same argument holds for the 16th Amendment, for the 18th Amendment, for the 21st Amendment. Do you get to pick and choose what you say is outmoded and what you will have? In that case, you have the proverbial government of laws and not of men. The 16th Amendment, income tax, they said it would be 3%. Again, that 3%. Yet look at it today. Did they ever envision that? Well, maybe we should just ignore that and say we shouldn't have an income tax. Well, no, unfortunately we can. But it does not be, to wit, that the law should just be junk because they are old. One of the things that Calvin Coolidge, one of my heroes, said is that laws are not so much made as they are discovered. And there are certain things which are consistent, which are eternal. Human nature is consistent, is eternal. We have our strengths, we have our weaknesses, and we must guard against those weaknesses, in some cases institutionally, but always personally.
No, that's a great point, and you actually going a little deeper into what you just mentioned. I think one solution would be, specifically if you look at an amendment on taxation. When we propose amendments, within the amendment there should be a restriction of how far it can go before you would have to go through the whole process to make significant changes. In other words, you should have to set a limit of how high a tax rate could ever go to, because I think we could have avoided a lot of this mess.
That's right. That's the hindsight. I don't think anyone expected that. And again, things changed very rapidly. Where when that was put in at 2 or 3%, and only for the highest incomes, before you knew it, World War I had intervened, and there was a wartime tax rate which shot up to a marginal tax rate of 71%, and which certainly hamstrung the returning peacetime economy and had to be done away with. So it is one of those things where you don't now. One of the perhaps beauties of the American Constitution is it is relatively brief. You take a look at, say, state constitutions. I live in New York, and that thing goes on for volumes, and it defines all sorts of things, like what you can do in the Adirondack Mountains and this and that and blah, 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 blah. So there are limits. One of the things I did was to be a public information officer for the New York State Governor's Office of Regulatory Reform. And what will often happen is that laws are enacted by the legislature, but then there are provisions in it that they will be implemented by regulation. We see this in Washington, where thousands and thousands of regulations come out each year, and the bureaucrats often go wild. If there is some inclination to stop them by the administration, some of them might be stopped. But when there is no inclination to stop them and to be elastic in terms of what they were allowed to do, which is to write laws for the rest of us on their own, as we are seeing in this administration, then God help the Republic.
Yeah, I want to bring up one thing, going back to Washington's administration, as he put his cabinet together. Of course, we didn't have all these agencies and things that we have today. but he had selected John Jay to be they formed the Supreme Court. He became the Chief Justice, and of course we know John Jay is one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which was used to help sell and promote the Constitution and the things that were contained within it and explain it to. Which, by the way, I don't understand how people can't look at the Federalist Papers today and understand what they meant. All the politicians that claim, well, it's not what they meant. I think we have plenty of evidence.
It's what they meant.
But my point is, when we compare to the current administration, and I understand that Barack Obama did not appoint Justice Roberts, but clearly going back in time, our founders would have been absolutely shocked and appalled at the decision with regards to Obamacare that came out by Justice Roberts. And I think just trying to link the past with the present, there's just such abuse and misuse of our laws today.
Right. Well, Obama is not the cause of our discomfort. He's a symptom of it. What happened with John Roberts was just startling.
Yeah, I think Barack Obama certainly has done his due to making things more difficult and adding to the problems, but he is not the creator, that's for sure.
And, if all of a sudden he were impeached and John Boehner or something became president, or Mitch McConnell or something, it would not change the fact that the American family structure is in tatters. That so many people have become used to dependency, that crony capitalism is flourishing not only on the Potomac but on the Hudson and probably 49 other state capitals, in terms of who knows who and who can get a subsidy for what, or that the American educational system, which we don't talk a lot about, is in a sense broken. And is creating mentalities which foster programs which don't work, political correctness, and just a lot of errant nonsense, while neglecting to provide for educations that previous generations took for granted, where the level of education and what kids knew in the generations before mine, or maybe even in mine, is startlingly better than what it is now, or the media. One of the things about being a historical researcher is that you get to go through old newspapers. And I would recommend that as an exercise to anyone. Go online. A lot of these are available online in one form or another. Go to the smallest podunk West Texas Panhandle, wherever, newspaper, upstate New York from 50, 60, 70 years ago, and you will see a media dealing with things of so much more substance and fairness in compared to what just about every paper today does, where there is almost nothing reported, where the stories make the first iteration of USA Today look like those Federalist Papers.
Yeah, it's actually a great point. It makes you scratch your head and wonder, who do you really blame? Do you blame the concept of corporate-owned media, or do you blame individuals as consumers? I always tend to blame the consumers. David, I want to ask you a quick question, and then I'll let you think about it while we take a brief break. So
okay.
Okay. So now I just got sidetracked, and I already forgot my question.
Let's take a brief break.
Let's take a quick break, and I'll bring it back. See, I believe.
Sometimes you feel like a nut.
Which is absolutely nuts, right? I mean, that's the same logic like me saying, since some of my money is contributing to your health, I have a right to tell you what to eat.
Sometimes you don't.
Members of Congress, they know they're doing something wrong, but they do it because they're putting the party or the president or themselves ahead of the rule of law.
No matter your mood, no matter your method, the matter here is clear.
This show is about defense of liberty, and it's about promoting the values that this country was built on, and that can't be forgotten.
Come join Brett and John Rappaport weekdays from 3 to 4 right here on Blog Talk Radio.
Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't.
The Final Say Radio Show is an original broadcast of Rappaport Media. For more The Final Say Radio Show podcasts, go to www.thefinalsay.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Final Say with your hosts, John and Brett Rappaport, our producer extraordinaire, Pietrusza, and our special guest, David Pietrusza. Hey, David, sorry, I forgot the question. I've been multitasking here. My daughter came home from school just a little while ago, and it is her 17th birthday today, so there's a lot of excitement going on in the Rappaport household. And even the dog is excited, so I got I had some. The whole world came into my office, so we had some fun there.
Well,
yeah,
I'm able to do that. I did that the other day, talking to someone without dogs or daughters, intruding.
Well, the family actually considered having you sing Happy Birthday, but we thought we'd not put you through that.
Oh, jeez. Or your audience.
Or put them through that. So here's the question I had for you. I've spent a lot of time over the years reading about the presidents, but other than in my lifetime, I'm really guilty of not having spent much time reading about all the prior Supreme Courts before, let's say, the Civil Rights Movement and forward. Would you say, given your experience in researching history, that the current Supreme, not just the current, but let's say the last couple of decades of Supreme Courts are more or less polarized than the Supreme Courts were in history? Because it feels to me like they've become a tool of the party in power instead of what the Founding Fathers probably intended them to be, which was really the body responsible for interpreting the law fairly.
Well, it's a party line vote almost. Maybe with a swing vote in the middle, usually appointed by a Republican, Sandra Day O'Connor or Justice Kennedy. We were hoping it was going to be a party line vote on Medicare and also a constitutional vote. That did not happen. But yeah, there is no thought, it seems, by at least one side, to just adjudicate the law as it is written, as opposed to the law as you want to write it or you think it should have been written. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. That was not always the case. I think it started to slide that way, really, after FDR started to pack the Supreme Court, where some justices got nervous, some got so nervous they retired. They were the 9 old men, after all. And then Roosevelt put his own people in, and they began to find constitutional all sorts of things that weren't constitutional. And then you had the Warren Court and Justice Brennan from New Jersey, I might add, who really made a silly putty of the Constitution. It took a long time for the court to recover from that, and now it sort of has, except in that one very big exception, and may yet totter off the brink again. This was one of the big debates of the progressive era, and one of the things which tore apart the Republican Party in 1912 was the recall of judges, whether on the Supreme Court or elsewhere. And Theodore Roosevelt wanted to do that because the justices weren't progressive enough at the time, and Taft, who was a great jurist, ended up as Supreme Court justice himself, resisted that. So the question of judicial activism has been with us for a while. Back then it was the progressives and such who were accusing the justices of being overly conservative. But they really weren't talking about them destroying the meaning of the law. They were arguing even then about this growth thing of the Constitution, of the law. There's a moment late in the 1920 presidential election where Calvin Coolidge, who wasn't saying much, oddly enough, but gives a speech and talks about how we are a government of laws and not of men. It's like, okay, nothing controversial about that. except to the guy running against him for vice president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who says, oh, no, it's got to be elastic. We've got to get with the times. We've got to be up there modern in 1920 land. And this is, not noticed by too many people, but that provides the indication of what his philosophy is going to be when he's Mr. New Deal and running the country.
Well, it seems you could probably point to Roosevelt and the multiple terms in office beyond two as possibly being the number one argument that you can make for term limits for the president, because you talk about stacking the court. A lot usually happens in 8 years. In 16 or God forbid 20 years, you could imagine you could literally turn the country on a dime, and permanently so.
Well, you certainly could. You have sometimes you'll go through an administration and no one will get to a point. I don't think Bill Clinton did, but 14 years or 12 years, you'll control everything for sure. And then once he was gone, you started to get some more moderate court appointees from Truman. But then again, you got generally more liberal appointees from Eisenhower. Things tend to be somewhat surprising. You appoint someone thinking you're going to get something, and you get something else. I think the most spectacular recent example of that was Douglas Souther, and on the converse of that, one of the great conservatives on the court was the only appointee of Jack Kennedy, Byron Whizzer White, who had been a previous associate and had sort of helped out on the 60 campaign and turned out to be maybe the most conservative member of the court when he was there.
Yeah, first, David, I have to give you some credit because one of my favorite books that I've read in a long, long time was 1920, The Year of Six Presidents. And I thought that was your book was fantastic, but it was such a fascinating story. Just the way you broke down the background and the history behind each president, and then the way you spoke about the different going-ons through the election. It was really a fascinating time and just a fascinating
you had the
story
League of
behind
Nations, your post-war period,
yeah.
America pulling out of the Depression, the women getting the vote nationwide, Prohibition, the Klan. Everything's going on. It's a really pivotal, interesting year, and I was lucky to stumble across it.
No, and what was interesting, so many of the things that were discussed there, I feel are kind of in the storyline today, and I think that one of the main differences is that some of the solutions that are being proposed and are, in my opinion, different, and also the fact that within these 6 different presidents, you had, two extreme ideologies. Today, I view, when you look at Mitt Romney running against Barack Obama, I don't think that Mitt Romney was actually that far different from Barack Obama. In fact, neither one of them was remotely conservative. And neither one of them has a real grasp of constitutional law, fiscal restraint. I mean, I know that Mitt Romney had discussed these things, but clearly there wasn't all that much in his past.
He discussed them, but it was difficult to prove anything from his background that he in fact would be implementing them, or how serious he was with them. And there were certain things during the campaign which struck a nerve on that very issue. The first being the Etch-a-Sketch moment.
Mm-hmm.
The second, and this was, I think, also worked, when Barack Obama did something, even by his standards, extremely unpresidential, which was about a week or so before the election, and he was at an interview with someone in the media, and he said, there's some guys you can just look at, and I look at Romney and I see a bull thrower. And he didn't say that. But in fact, I think he hit upon something which was you really weren't sure where Romney stood. There were about 30 million votes out there, I think, because turnout wasn't very high. John McLaughlin, the pollster, was talking about this in Albany a few weeks ago. And, that could have turned out to vote for Romney. I mean, it is not true that he got fewer votes than McCain, but he got fewer votes than he should have. And I think a lot of folks who were disinclined to the Obama administration, in the end didn't come out to vote for him because they did not trust him to do what he said he was going to do. And in that case, they're wanting, it was something which was ideal, fell into that category of the perfect being the enemy of the good, or at least the mediocre.
No, that's absolutely right. One other startling difference between your discussion of the 1920 election was the view between the various candidates of international organizations of whether they should be involved in foreign affairs, but also the League of Nations or the precursor of the United Nations. And of course, in this past election, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama are more than willing to be, globalists involved in any of these organizations and don't really fully grasp the idea of American sovereignty.
Well, one of the other flaws of the Constitution, perhaps it was an old idea. Maybe we should get rid of it. We don't have to listen to it. Is that treaties supersede the Constitution? So I don't like that. So maybe that's an old idea, and maybe treaties shouldn't supersede the Constitution. But in fact, they do. And that isn't even a backdoor assault on sovereignty. That's a front door assault in many cases when it impacts how Americans shall internally conduct their own affairs. It's one thing to cooperate with someone on health or perhaps disarmament or some aspect of foreign affairs, but to talk about treaties coming down the pike on firearms and maybe do things that way, which the American people would not vote on for themselves or through their representatives directly, is a very frightening thing. So the question of sovereignty. Now, let's go back a year or so. Let's go back to Libya. And I don't mean Benghazi. I mean when the original riots start breaking out and Americans commit to the use of force, whether it's leading from behind or whatever, but most of those bombs and drones and whatever else which was launched against Muammar Gaddafi, which we at that point had a fairly working relationship with, where there was no great national interest involved. He had been essentially defanged by the Bush administration and was working as an opponent of al-Qaeda. But does the president report to the Congress as per the War Powers Act, let alone the Constitution? No. What does he do? He reports to NATO and the United Nations and says, no, I don't have to go to Congress. I went to the United Nations. Excuse me. And what did the Congress do about that? Well, they said, we can make some points banging our chests against Muammar Gaddafi, so we'll just sort of sneeze on this one, or not let it go by, or what they do is snooze on it. And these things early on, where the Congress was bypassed, I think has led to this increased talk of executive power, executive orders. It's important, so I'll just do it. And the question is not only where does it end, but where are we now?
No, that's an excellent question and a great point. In fact, I think the administration had actually taken those actions on purpose because they knew with the upcoming election that the House was only limited to how they could react, because certainly they don't want to come out being big. You never want to come out publicly supporting.
Right, you didn't want to look like
any
a stooge
kind of a terrorist. Yeah, I mean it's so. And
his prior history was none too good.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I think
even if he was continuing to be a bad actor, I mean, I do not understand why he could not have reported to Congress, except his complete disregard of Congress and not wanting. I was told by a member of Congress in the last year that even when he cooperates with Congress, i.e., when there is a law passed by Congress and he signs it, that the ceremonies. Remember how Lyndon Johnson would use a different pen and sign every letter differently and dot the I's with a different pen, and it'd be all these members of Congress standing around him. And it's like, well, what does that show? It shows that the law is really a product of Congress and is there is some cooperation here. Obama will not go to that level. Does not want to be shown as working with Congress. It is in his interest, that sort of triangulation, to be the community organizer at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, who is taking it to Congress and to the establishment in Washington, even though he is certainly numero uno in the establishment, and to indicate that he is just not working with them, and that anything that goes wrong can be blamed on them, not on him.
Well, no, and that's a great point, and you could see it in the fact that Congress has a approval rating in the low teens at best, and the president still manages to have mid-range 40s.
That's right. I mean, his right after the election. He claims to have this amazing mandate to do anything, and his approval ratings fell below 50%. Also, if he had this amazing mandate, he would have gotten like 55%, or he might have carried in a Democratic Congress with him. None of the above. So he does not have a mandate, and even when you have a mandate, we, again, not to be tiresome, but we have a Congress, we have a Constitution.
That's absolutely correct. Well, we have a few short minutes left in the program, so I'd like to just ask you one more question, and that would be looking back at Presidents George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Barack Obama. If you had to pick one thing that they did which was extraordinary, or one thing that you thought that was detrimental to their presidency, and just like you to offer one for each.
Boy, that's a tough one, Jordan. That's a tough homework assignment. Washington really does just about everything right in terms of his presidency. He does not foresee the parties coming forward. He really sidesteps that whole issue, and he can still do that. But to think long term that people are not going to go into that is a problem. Yes, factionalism is bad, partisanship is bad, but nonetheless, you need some working coalition. Otherwise, you can end up like Europe, where the two-party system has been a blessing to us, as opposed to a lot of European history, where you've had the 14-party system, or even to this day in Israel, where things are so fractured. So we kind of lucked out on that one. Lincoln, we're seeing an increased. I mean, obviously, Lincoln holds the Union together. His rhetoric is so inspirational. In his death, he becomes a figure to bind the nation together. But there's an increasing tendency now to say, well, what was the cost? What was the cost? What was the cost in terms of civil liberties, habeas corpus, seizing newspaper offices, et cetera, et cetera? And there's a lot of that. The eternal question, do the ends justify the means? And that is a tough one. It was a great end to preserve the Union, to abolish slavery, although that was a secondary thing for much of his presidency and certainly his career. But I mean, those are very bad precedents that you can just lock up thousands of people. You can ignore the Supreme Court saying, could you charge these people with something? Not good. Barack Obama, where does one begin in the negative? I guess the health care is the most egregious. We have yet to see its fruits fully, but I think it's even now it helps hold back the economy or any semblance of a genuine recovery. In terms of something positive, I suppose one might say the killing of bin Laden, although the old saw about we stand so high because we stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm not saying that George W. Bush was a giant in any regard in the presidency, but he certainly laid the groundwork, whether it's methods of interrogation or just a very vigorous policy to go after the terrorists, which made the bin Laden thing possible.
Well, that was very insightful and thoughtful, and I appreciate you doing that, answering those three on such a short notice, because it was pretty...
Whoa, okay. Where do I go now?
Anyway, we are on with David Pietrusza, incredible author of many books, including 1920, The Year of Six Presidents, and Silent Cal's Almanac. I want to thank you so much for taking the time today, and just an announcement to our audience, you will be joining us on a more regular basis, and I'm sure they will certainly enjoy the insight and the history that you will bring to the program.
Well, I hope so, and I'm glad to join you folks and spout off on matters historical and contemporary.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Take care. Well, again, that was David Pietrusza, author, historian. You could see him on the History Channel and many of the discussions about the history of presidents. He was on very recently, and just his books are excellent. You really do have to stop at a Barnes & Noble or an Amazon and pick those up. I've enjoyed them very much. In fact, every time I give a speech, I actually go to the Calvin Coolidge ones for great quotes, and they're just excellent to be used. Again, thank you so much, David.